Ever since my son hit puberty, he started drifting away from me. After he got married, he became even more withdrawn, like a stranger in his own home. My daughter-in-law wasn't any better. They both treated me like some kind of curse, never inviting me over, never visiting as if I didn't exist. It hurt more than I could ever say. After 2 long months without a single word from my son, I decided to go see them myself, just to make sure they were all right. But what I found left me frozen. My daughter-in-law was perfectly fine, yet my son was nowhere to be found. Gone. A mother's instinct told me something was terribly wrong, and I had to uncover the truth. What I discovered next will shock you. Stay with me until the end of this video to find out what really happened. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support me. My dear listeners, your presence means more than you think. That night I dropped the cup 3 times before it finally shattered against the floor. The sound was sharp and clean, like something inside me had cracked too. The pie I had baked for dinner burned black at the edges, and the oven made a faint popping sound that startled me enough to spill flour across the counter. I used to laugh at people who believed in omens, but that night my heart pounded with a strange heaviness that refused to settle. It was the kind of feeling you can't explain, only endure. 2 months. No call, no message, not even a short text from Logan. In 35 years of being his mother, such silence had never existed between us. I tried to convince myself he was busy. Work perhaps, or traveling somewhere where reception was bad. But every time I reached for my phone and saw the blank screen, the air around me grew tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. I walked through the small house in Savannah, the one he helped me buy after his father passed. The evening light fell softly through the curtains, turning the dust into gold. On the mantel stood a photograph of Logan at 10 years old, grinning with a missing front tooth, holding up a sandcastle that had already begun to collapse. His smile seemed frozen in time, untouched by the storms that came later. I reached out and traced the edge of the frame with my fingertip. The glass was cold. Something was wrong. I could feel it not in my mind, but in my bones. That old primal sense that mothers carry like a sixth sense. It wasn't anxiety or imagination. It was a pulse that told me my son was out there and something had broken his peace. I turned off the oven, poured the burnt pie into the trash, and stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. They say a mother always knows. That night I stopped fighting the thought. I knew this wasn't about a missed call or a forgotten visit. It was the beginning of something much darker, and the silence between us was only the first crack in the mirror. The next morning, I packed a basket of homemade bread still warm from the oven, wrapped in a blue checkered cloth the way Logan always liked. I told myself it was just a visit, a simple gesture from a mother who hadn't seen her son in too long. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed to see him with my own eyes. No text, no call could ease the ache that had settled in my chest. The highway from Savannah to the city stretched endlessly ahead, lined with oak trees dripping with moss. I drove with the windows half open, letting the morning air brush against my face. The basket sat on the passenger seat, its sweet smell of butter and flour filling the car, reminding me of simpler times when Logan would sneak into the kitchen and steal a roll before dinner. Those memories felt distant now, like someone else's life. 2 hours later, I arrived at the apartment complex where Logan and Nora lived. It was a sleek, modern building with glass balconies and trimmed hedges, the kind of place where everything looked perfect from the outside. At the front desk, a young receptionist smiled politely when I asked if Logan was home. She checked something on her screen, then said lightly, almost without thinking, "They're rarely here. Mostly we just see 2 women coming and going." 2 women. The words echoed in my mind. I blinked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. My voice came out softer than I intended. 2 women. The receptionist hesitated, realizing she might have said too much, then forced a smile. Oh, maybe friends or guests. You know how city people are. I nodded, but my stomach tightened. I thanked her and walked to the elevator, my reflection in the mirror beside the doors pale and still. I pressed the button to the 12th floor, my fingers trembling slightly. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Nora had her sister visiting, but why hadn't Logan called? Why hadn't he said anything? When the door finally opened, I stood before their apartment and took a deep breath. My heart thudded so loudly, I was afraid someone inside might hear it. I fixed a small smile on my face and pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed faintly behind the door. After a pause, I called out softly, hoping to sound calm. "It's Mom. I brought some bread for you two." No answer. Only the quiet hum of the hallway lights. I waited, holding the basket tighter, pretending I didn't notice the unease creeping through my veins. When the door finally opened, the smell hit me first. Heavy perfume mixed with the sharp scent of cleaning spray, like someone trying to erase something that shouldn't have been there. Nora stood in the doorway, her makeup thick and smudged at the edges, her lipstick too bright for morning. She wore a silk robe that looked new, the kind bought to impress, not to relax in. Behind her, a young woman appeared, startled. She couldn't have been more than 25, with blonde hair falling loosely over her shoulders and a thin nightdress that barely covered her knees. The girl's name slipped out of Nora's mouth almost casually, Riley Thompson. Her voice was light, almost practiced, as if she had rehearsed the introduction for this exact moment. The apartment was a mess. Dresses draped over the sofa, a half-empty wine glass on the coffee table, a trail of shoes leading toward the bedroom. The air was thick with something I couldn't name: perfume, alcohol disinfectant, a scent that clung to my throat and made me want to step back. My fingers tightened around the handle of the bread basket, the woven edge pressing into my skin. Nora leaned against the doorframe, her smile stretched and uneasy. "Oh, Mrs. Grant, what a surprise. You should have called first. Logan's not here right now. He's busy with some things." Her tone was light, but her eyes flickered, darting toward the blonde girl, who pretended to adjust the curtain, but kept glancing nervously at me. I looked around, trying to piece together the silence. The framed wedding photo that used to hang proudly by the dining table was lying face down on the sideboard. A layer of dust had settled on it, as if it hadn't been touched in weeks. On the shoe rack by the door, Logan's leather boots were gone. Only Nora's heels remained, and a pair of slippers that didn't belong to either of them. "Where is Logan?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, though I felt my pulse in my throat. Nora blinked, pretending to think. "Oh, you know how he is. Always on the move, never still." Her answer hung in the air like a lie that smelled of roses and wine. I nodded slowly, pretending to believe her, though every instinct in me screamed something was terribly wrong. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the basket. The warmth of the bread had faded. Nora waved her hand dismissively, her bracelets jingling as if to punctuate her lie. "He just had a little food poisoning," she said lightly. "They kept him overnight at the hospital for fluids, but he'll be home tomorrow." Her voice was smooth, practiced, like someone used to saying whatever needed to be said to end a conversation. I felt my stomach tighten. Food poisoning. Logan had always been careful with food, even a bit obsessive. I took a step closer, keeping my tone calm. "Which hospital is he in? I'd like to stop by and see him." For a split second, something flickered in Nora's eyes before she smiled, slow and cold. "Oh, he specifically asked that no one visit," she said. "He didn't want to worry you." Her lips curled just enough to suggest pity, but her eyes gave nothing. Behind her, Riley stood awkwardly, pretending to tidy the table, but failing to hide her unease. Her hands trembled slightly as she rearranged the wine glasses, her gaze darting to Nora as if waiting for permission to speak or permission to stay silent. I noticed how she avoided looking at me, how her face turned pale when I mentioned the hospital. The air felt heavier. My heart pounded with a slow, measured rhythm, the kind that comes before something breaks. I forced myself to look around the apartment again, searching for anything that didn't fit. That was when I saw it. 2 plane tickets on the dining table, half covered by a glossy magazine. The corner of one ticket showed the word Miami, printed clearly in bold black letters. Next to them sat an open suitcase half packed. Dresses, beachwear, sunglasses, and a travel-sized bottle of sunscreen lay in plain sight. The realization hit me so hard, I forgot to breathe for a moment. My son was supposedly sick in a hospital bed, and these 2 women were planning a trip to Miami. I turned back to Nora, my voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut through her false charm. "Going somewhere warm, are we?" Nora's smile faltered, just for an instant before she regained her composure. "Oh, that it's just a work thing." For Riley. I'm helping her pack. Riley froze, then forced a weak laugh, eyes still down. The silence between them spoke louder than their excuses ever could. I held the basket tighter, feeling the weight of everything I didn't yet know, pressing down on me. My throat was dry, my chest heavy. Something inside whispered that the lies were only beginning, and that my son, wherever he was, needed me to find the truth. I used to be known as Mrs. Grant, the strict math teacher at Savannah High. My students feared my sharp tone but came to respect my fairness. I believed in discipline, in the clean order of numbers, in the certainty that 2 and 2 would always make 4. Life, however, was never that simple. At 40, I discovered my husband's affair with a woman barely older than my son. The truth came quietly, like a paper cut, sharp, invisible, and slow to bleed. There was no screaming, no broken dishes, just silence, heavy enough to crush everything we had built. I signed the divorce papers without tears. That day, I promised myself never to remarry, never to hand my trust to anyone again. After the divorce, I sold our old house and bought a small one near the Savannah River. It was modest white walls, creaking floors, a porch covered in ivy, but it was mine. Every morning, I brewed coffee and watched the fog lift off the water, feeling a strange kind of peace in solitude. I learned to live carefully, counting every expense, keeping receipts like prayers. Yet even in my quiet life, I couldn't ignore the children who had no one. I began tutoring orphans for free after school. They were bright, eager, and hungry for kindness. Some brought me flowers from the roadside. Others left little thank you notes folded into stars. People in town started calling me the kind mother of Savannah. I didn't feel like a mother anymore, but perhaps that was why I wanted to be one for someone else. Years passed. I grew stronger, wiser, sharper. Loneliness taught me self-respect. I began reading about finance, watching the market, the way others watch the weather. I opened a savings account, invested small sums into a local electronics company, and tended the small farm I inherited from my sister, a quiet patch of land with peach trees and an old barn. It brought in little profit, but it gave me purpose. That farm, the stocks, and every careful choice I made became the foundation of my later life, and unknowingly the reason for the storm that would come. Logan was my only child, my only real hope after the divorce. From the moment he could count to 10 before his classmates, I knew he had a gift. Numbers came to him like music. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. Teachers used to call him the boy who solved silence. He didn't talk much, but his answers spoke for him. I loved that quiet brilliance, even when it made him seem distant. As he grew older, that distance widened. He became more reserved, thoughtful in ways I couldn't always reach. I would find him sitting by the river after school, staring at the water instead of talking about his day. When I asked what was wrong, he would smile faintly and say, "Nothing ever is, Mom." It was a phrase that comforted and broke me at once. When he received a scholarship to study in France, I felt both pride and fear. It was the dream I had worked my whole life for, a better future for him. Yet when he boarded that plane, I realized I was sending away the only piece of home I had left. In the beginning, he wrote often. Small updates, photos of Parisian streets, polite words that made me feel included. But slowly the messages became shorter, colder, as if life there had erased the boy I knew. Now his emails come once a month, a few lines that read like formal reports. Classes are going well. Work is demanding. Hope you're healthy. No warmth, no questions, just sentences that sound rehearsed. I read them over and over, searching for a trace of my son beneath the politeness. In the photos he sends, he wears tailored suits, holding a glass of wine in elegant cafes, always surrounded by people, yet looking entirely alone. His smile is courteous, the kind you give to strangers at business dinners. But his eyes, those same gray eyes that once sparkled when he solved a math puzzle, now carry a quiet emptiness. I've learned not to ask too much. Every mother must let go eventually, I tell myself. But letting go feels different when the distance isn't just miles, it's silence. Still, I keep believing. He's young, I whisper each night before bed. He just needs time to find his way back. When Logan turned 34, he sent me an email that began with 3 words: "I got married." No proposal, no photos, no phone call. Just a scanned copy of the marriage certificate attached at the bottom, as if it were another business document. I stared at it for a long time, reading his name beside hers. Nora Bennett. The signature neat, deliberate, and painfully unfamiliar. Nora worked in accounting, he wrote. Quiet, private, not fond of socializing. That was all he said. No story about how they met, no details about the ceremony, nothing that sounded like love. I replied with congratulations, adding a simple, "I'd love to meet her soon." He never responded. The first time I met Nora was months later when Logan invited me for coffee. She arrived 10 minutes late wearing a beige suit and carrying a small black handbag that matched her shoes perfectly. Everything about her was precise. Her posture, her tone, even the way she held her cup by the handle, as if afraid of fingerprints. She extended her hand briefly. Her grip was cold and quick, her eyes scanning me like an auditor checking for errors. That first meeting lasted less than half an hour, but I remember every second of it, the polite silence, the way Logan looked at his watch instead of at either of us, and the moment Nora called him Mr. Carter by mistake, then laughed too quickly to cover it up. There was something missing in that woman, a warmth that should have existed, but didn't. She never asked about my life, never used the word mom, never even smiled unless she had to. When I mentioned family gatherings or holidays, she nodded vaguely, her mind already somewhere else. After their wedding, they rented an apartment across town. I expected invitations, dinners, or at least a weekend visit. But none came. Every time I offered to drop by, Logan had an excuse. "We're busy, the house isn't ready, Nora's not feeling well." Months turned into years, and I began to realize the distance between us wasn't just physical, it was a deliberate wall. Sometimes I wondered if Nora had built it, or if my son had helped her. I used to call every Sunday right after breakfast. It became a habit, like watering a plant that never bloomed. Most of the time, the calls went unanswered. Occasionally, Logan would pick up his voice rushed and distant, saying he was busy or heading into a meeting. The rest of the time, my messages were left unread, that small gray scene mark glowing on my phone like a quiet rejection. During holidays, I sent packages, handmade scarves, books he once loved, boxes of his favorite cookies. The postal receipts confirmed they were delivered, but I never received a thank you, not even a line. I told myself people forget that life moves fast, that perhaps Nora simply didn't like sentimental gestures. But deep down, I knew it was something else. A kind of silence too deliberate to be accidental. One autumn afternoon, after days of hesitation, I decided to drive to their apartment without notice. I baked a pie apple and cinnamon Logan's favorite and placed it carefully in a basket. The rain was light when I left home, the kind that blurs reflections on the windshield. When I arrived, I stood in front of their door, heart pounding, and pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed softly behind the door. I waited. 1 minute. 2. 5. Nothing. But I heard it faint music from inside, the sound of footsteps, and a woman's laugh, muffled but unmistakable. They were home. And yet no one came to open the door. I stayed there longer than I should have, clutching the basket, rain soaking through my coat. Eventually, I left the pie on the doorstep and walked back to my car. The drive home felt endless. Every red light became a question I couldn't answer. What had I done wrong? Was I too present, too proud, too old-fashioned to fit into my son's new world? The questions circled endlessly in my mind like rain against the car window. Years have passed, but that day still lingers in me like a bruise that never fully fades. I once thought my son's marriage would be a beginning, a sign that he had built a family, that love would bring him closer to warmth and belonging. But I was wrong. It wasn't a new beginning. It was a locked door. And I've been standing outside ever since. When Logan got married, I wanted to honor my promise, a mother's word that had been written in silence long before any contract. I transferred the management rights of Carter Hill Farm to him as a wedding gift. The land had been in our family for generations, a quiet stretch of pasture and orchards near the river, worth about $1.2 million. It wasn't just property. It was memory, legacy, and the proof that our family name still meant something solid in a world that changed too fast. The transfer, however, wasn't absolute. My lawyer drafted it carefully, a conditional inheritance. Logan would gain full ownership only after 3 years of marriage, provided that the farm continued to operate profitably and stayed under his personal supervision. It was both a safety measure and a lesson. Stability, first, trust later. He had nodded when I explained it, saying he understood. I wanted to believe he did. In the first few months, I rarely heard from them. Then unexpectedly, Nora began calling, not to chat, but to ask questions. At first, it was about taxes, then about dividends, stock performance, and bank accounts. Her voice always polite, but her curiosity far sharper than her words. I remember one afternoon vividly. She came to visit holding a notepad, dressed in her usual beige suit. Over tea, she smiled and said she wanted to learn how investments worked. But the way she phrased her questions about my savings certificates, my trust accounts, and the names of my financial advisors made me uneasy. I brushed off her inquiries with vague answers, but she didn't miss a beat, pressing on with gentle persistence that felt almost rehearsed. It wasn't greed I saw in her eyes, not yet. It was calculation. The kind of focus that doesn't come from interest, but from intent. She was studying me, my habits, my assets, my weaknesses. That night, as I looked over the papers of Carter Hill, I caught myself wondering if I had made a mistake. Perhaps in giving too much, I had placed the very thing I built into the wrong hands. Back to the present. Nora's voice still rang in my ears long after the door slammed shut. We don't need anyone teaching us how to live. She had snapped her tone, slicing through the air like glass. For a few seconds, I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand still on the doorknob, feeling the heat rise in my chest. I wanted to say something to defend myself, but the words never made it past my throat. Pride and pain met halfway, turning into silence. I swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. Behind her, Riley appeared again, almost on cue. She touched Nora's waist lightly, a gesture meant to calm, but it was too intimate, too natural. The way Nora leaned slightly into her touch, it wasn't friendship. It was something else. In that instant, everything inside me shifted. The polite explanations, the vague stories about a friend staying over, they all began to crumble. I saw it now clear as daylight. Riley was not just a house guest. I turned away, pretending not to notice, pretending I hadn't just seen the truth, hiding in plain sight. My legs felt heavy as I walked down the hallway, each step echoing like a heartbeat. Outside, the afternoon sun had already turned harsh, reflecting off the glass doors, but I didn't feel its warmth. I reached my car, placed the basket of cold bread on the passenger seat, and sat there in silence. My heart whispered what my mind wasn't ready to admit. No one can hide from a mother forever. I stayed parked across the street for hours that day, watching the building. People came and went, a delivery man, a neighbor walking her dog, children laughing as they ran past. But my eyes never left that 12th floor balcony. Sometimes the curtain would move, and I'd catch a glimpse of Nora's silhouette. Once I saw Riley step out, phone in hand, looking down at the street like she sensed I was there. The next morning I returned, and the morning after that. I told myself it was concern, but deep down I knew it was the beginning of something else, an investigation. My first real one. I noted the cars that came and went, the lights that stayed on late into the night, the patterns of movement. It was a quiet obsession, one that kept me awake, but also alive. By the end of the second day, I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a witness. On the second morning, I parked in the same spot across from their building, pretending to read a newspaper while my eyes never left the entrance. At exactly 9:30, the glass doors opened, and there they were, Nora and Riley, dressed as if they were heading to brunch at a luxury hotel. Nora wore a fitted cream blazer, her hair pinned up neatly, while Riley followed in a silk dress and oversized sunglasses. They laughed softly, walking close together, their movements too synchronized to be casual. My pulse quickened. They didn't look like two people worried about a man recovering from food poisoning. They looked like women with secrets. I watched as they got into a silver sedan, Nora in the driver's seat, Riley adjusting the mirror like it was her own car. I started my engine a moment later, keeping a safe distance as they merged into traffic. The morning air was bright and sharp, but I could barely breathe. The city blurred by coffee shops, banks, people walking dogs, ordinary life continuing unaware of the storm brewing inside me. After 15 minutes, they turned into the parking area of a private hospital, the kind of place reserved for executives and the wealthy. Its white facade gleamed like marble, and even the doormen wore suits. I parked 2 blocks away, careful not to be noticed, and walked the rest of the way, keeping my pace slow. I knew the law. Following too closely could be considered stalking. I had taught ethics and civic responsibility for years. I understood boundaries. But this wasn't curiosity. It was survival. A mother has the right to know the truth when her son's name is wrapped in lies. From behind a marble column, I saw them sign in at the reception desk. The nurse handed them visitor badges. Nora smiled politely, whispered something to Riley, and they disappeared down the hallway marked Recovery Wing, private patients only. I froze. The words on that sign hit me harder than I expected. Recovery Wing, where patients stayed after surgery, not food poisoning. My fingers tightened around my purse strap until my knuckles turned white. Why would they come here of all places? Why would they visit this section if Logan was simply resting at home? I took a small step closer, trying to catch another glimpse, but they were gone. Only the automatic door sliding shut, erasing their laughter into silence. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat colder than the last. Something wasn't right. And whatever it was, it had begun here in that shining, silent hospital. I wrapped a silk scarf around my head, pulled a mask over my face, and slipped on a pair of sunglasses, large enough to hide half my features. In the reflection of the hospital's glass door, I barely recognized myself, just another woman in her 60s, moving slowly, leaning on the wall, as if dizzy. When I stumbled near the reception desk, a nurse immediately came to help. "Are you all right, ma'am?" she asked kindly. I nodded faintly and murmured that I was feeling lightheaded. Within minutes, they had me seated in the patient reception area offering water and paperwork. It was easier than I expected. From my chair, I watched Nora at the administration desk, signing forms with brisk, precise strokes, her lips pressed into a thin line. Riley stood beside her, clutching a tote bag filled with what looked like toiletries and folded clothes. She kept her eyes, low shoulders tense, as if she wanted to disappear. The nurse behind the counter smiled politely, but Nora never looked up, never smiled back. The tension between them was palpable, a quiet anxiety that only comes from fear of exposure. I glanced down at the clipboard in my lap, pretending to fill it out while listening carefully. I caught fragments of Nora's voice, private room, confidential, no visitors. Each word deepened the pit forming in my stomach. When they walked away toward the elevators, I knew this was my chance. I approached the front desk again and asked softly if anyone could help me find a missing family member. It wasn't entirely a lie my son was missing, at least from my life. The young nurse hesitated, glancing toward the back office. I lowered my mask just enough for her to see my face. "Mary," I said quietly. For a moment she blinked, then her eyes widened. "Mrs. Grant. I haven't seen you in years. We had taught together once decades ago before she changed careers." The recognition softened her immediately. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Mary, I think my son is here under another name. Please, can you check the system?" Just once. She hesitated, then turned to her computer. Her fingers clicked over the keyboard, and I felt time slow. The glow of the monitor reflected on her glasses. After a moment, her face went pale. She whispered, "Oh my God." I leaned forward, heart pounding. "What does it say?" She turned the screen slightly toward me. On it, one line blinked in soft gray letters. Patient L. Carter. Post-operative recovery. Gender reassignment. Complication. For a moment, the air left my lungs. My fingers trembled against the counter. The letters blurred the room, spinning faintly. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. "Logan, my son. What had they done to you?" The words on the screen didn't make sense at first. My mind refused to connect them, as if language itself had failed me. Gender reassignment. I whispered the syllables, heavy, foreign, impossible. My hands trembled on the counter. Mary said something, maybe my name, but her voice was distant, like coming through water. I could only stare at the gray letters glowing on the monitor. Logan, my son. The boy I had carried for 9 months, the child who once fell asleep on my shoulder after solving his first math puzzle. Gone. It wasn't judgment that struck me. It was loss. A deep, hollow ache that felt like mourning someone still alive. I thought of the way he used to run down the riverbank, hair messy, face full of light. I could still smell the soap he used, still hear his laughter echoing through the kitchen. Now it was as if all of that had vanished into a name I no longer recognized. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady the rhythm of my heart. Mary touched my shoulder gently. "Maybe you should sit down," she said. I nodded but didn't move. I didn't need a chair. I needed air. I stepped outside into the corridor, the cold fluorescent light blinding my eyes. Everything felt unreal. The polished floor, the echo of footsteps, the faint beeping of medical machines. I walked toward the exit in slow, mechanical steps, feeling the blood rush in my ears. By the time I reached the parking lot, tears were already sliding down my cheeks. I sat in my car, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was pale and unfamiliar. My lips moved before I even realized it. "If you're in pain, I'll find you," I whispered. "No matter who you are now, you're still my child." Something inside me shifted, then a quiet clarity cutting through the grief. The shock didn't fade, but beneath it, there was resolve. Love stripped of every condition I had ever placed on it. I understood finally that motherhood wasn't about understanding every choice. It was about standing still when the world turned upside down and choosing to reach out anyway. He was still my son, or maybe now my daughter, but the bond between us hadn't changed. It had only been hidden under fear, under distance, under everything I hadn't asked. And I would not lose him again, not to secrecy, not to shame, to know the truth. I had to see him with my own eyes. I was still standing by the reception desk when the nurses spoke in low voices, thinking they would not be heard, but their words crossed the tiled floor and landed in my ears like stones. They said that the family member who identified themselves as a patient visitor insisted that no one be allowed to see the patient, and yet that same person never came to the bedside. The tone was casual, the kind of office gossip you ignore until it fits into the shape of your own doubts. I felt my chest tighten as the pieces slid together. Nothing ever fits that neatly unless someone is putting them there. I turned toward the recovery corridor and pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the observation window. Beyond it, in the muted light, I could see Nora pacing, her posture sharp and quick, the lines around her mouth drawn harder than usual. Riley stood beside her with a bag in her hand, shoulders hunched, the mask of composure slipping when no one looked directly at her. They argued in short-clipped bursts, words I could not hear, but body language that spelled an argument of consequence. At one point, Nora reached into her clutch and pressed an envelope into the hands of a man in scrubs who had the tired, practiced look of a doctor who had seen many private arrangements. The exchange was swift. The envelope slid into his pocket as if it were routine. Money for convenience or silence or expedited services I did not know. But the sight of it made the blood drain from my face. A security guard noticed me and came over with the official question about needing assistance. I smiled, the shape of a woman who has been trained to meet strangers with polite reserve, and I declined. I moved slowly, pretending to consult a leaflet, while my eyes stayed fixed on the corridor. The guard lingered politely, and then moved on, assuming I had been comforted. In truth, I had been sharpened. The first cold prick of suspicion that had been whispering in my bones resolved into a bright, immovable certainty. They were hiding something, and it was not merely the trivial privacy of a patient recovering from a passing illness. When I left the hospital, the world outside felt oddly loud, as if the city had been turned up a notch to compensate for the silence that had fallen over me. I do not remember the drive home in the ordinary way as a sequence of turns, lights, and signals. Instead, I remember the taste of antiseptic that clung to my tongue, the way the smell seemed to sit behind my teeth, a metallic reminder of disinfected rooms and hushed corridors. My hands gripped the steering wheel, like a woman who was anchoring herself against a sudden tide. My thoughts moved in a single direction, not in circles. If they were capable of dressing the truth with lies so neatly, then they were capable of other things I did not want to imagine. I repeated to myself a promise that formed slowly and then hardened. I will find out the truth. I told the empty car, and the car seemed to accept the command like a vessel given a course. I drove home with the light in the dashboard blurring into lines, the city glass sliding by like frames in a film. At each red light, my eyes searched the rearview mirror as if waiting for someone to appear, and confirm that my suspicion was a mistake. No one did. The chill under my ribs did not leave. The nurse gossip, the envelope, the guarded air in the recovery wing had pushed me from intuition into action. If they were deceiving my family, I would pull aside the curtain and show the room for what it was. I would not be the mother who asked and accepted gentle untruths. I would be the mother who took the light to every shadow. I waited until the hospital halls thinned and the night nurses began their rounds, my borrowed badge cold against my palm. Mary had trusted me with the card, a small kindness that felt like betrayal and salvation at once. I walked past the nurse's station with my head down, carrying a cup of decaf I had pretended to need, listening to the beeps and soft footsteps, like a woman who had rehearsed the rhythm of this place. The fluorescent lights hummed low, and the air smelled of antiseptic and something sweeter, like someone had cried recently, and the scent had seeped into the sheets. At the end of the corridor, I paused, counting breaths the way I used to teach my students to count through a difficult problem. The recovery rooms were behind a curtain, their numbers dim on the wall, and I could feel the pulse of life through the thin fabric. I slipped inside the nearest room and let the curtain fall behind me, like a slow curtain on a stage I had no right to enter. The light was low, a lamp at the bedside casting a pale halo. Machines hummed, recording heartbeats and breaths in quiet loops. In that dimness, a figure lay wrapped in pale linens. At first, my eyes took in detail, like someone reading a list without understanding its meaning. The shoulders were slight, the outline smaller than I had imagined, and the hair fell in soft brown waves across the pillow. In the face, I recognized the slope of a familiar nose, the line of a jaw that had once been stubborn and boyish. But now the features were softer, touched by a new vulnerability. My throat closed. The chest rose and fell beneath the sheet, each breath deliberate and fragile. The stitches along the sternum were obvious neat rows of small, dark marks, and a finer line at the base of the throat suggested recent surgery. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something salt and human, like fresh tears. I had read medical notes, asked questions, pretended to understand. None of that prepared me for the sight of those stitches and the silence that settled in my bones. My hand moved before my thought. It was a small, absurd gesture, the kind of thing I had done when Logan was a child, and a scraped knee needed a mother more than medicine. My fingers trembled as they brushed the inside of the wrist. The skin was warm and thin, the pulse a small and steady drum. For a moment, the room held its breath with me. The eyes opened slowly, searching unfocused at first, and then finding me as if the world had rearranged itself in a single terrible shift. The voice that followed was a single sound wrapped in surprise and fear. Mom. The word landed in me like thunder that did not break the sky but rearranged its shape. I had no prepared speech, no counsel about acceptance or anger. There was only a rush of memory and love that pushed past confusion and every prejudice I had not known I carried. I sat down on the plastic chair beside the bed, feeling both too heavy and too light, and I let the tears come because there was no room for anything else in that narrow humming space. I put my hand over the wrist again and spoke without thinking of grammar or judgment. "I am here," I said, and the voice that answered in my own chest was made of resolve and shame and a fierce kindness I did not know I could show. "I will not leave you alone." My hands closed around his as if holding the last warm thing in a winter room. His fingers were small and shaking, his plea coming out in hurried fragments that sounded like a prayer and a confession at once. He begged me not to tell anyone. He said he did not want to be hated. The fear in his voice was a physical thing that pressed against my ribs and made it hard to breathe. He spoke of Bangkok in broken sentences, of an operating room, and a surgeon, and a decision made alone. At first, the procedure had seemed like an answer, a quiet door opening to a life that fit. And then complications had come like a storm that no one had warned him about. He explained that the complications forced him to return to the United States. They required treatment that could only be done here. He had hoped to manage everything without making the world know. When I asked why he had hidden it, he lowered his eyes, and the words came like an apology. He remembered the betrayal I had carried. He feared that his truth would hurt me as if it were another cut. The confession held both reasoning and sorrow. It landed on my chest and settled there with the weight of decades. I felt a jagged mix of anger and compassion. I wanted to demand answers, to ask why he had made choices in secret, to know who had helped him and where decisions had been made. Instead, I smoothed the hair at his temple and kept my questions inside, because his voice had the brittle edge of someone who had already been judged by too many strangers. I thought of every small thing I had done to keep him safe through childhood. Packed lunches, late-night coughs, the way I had waited at the bus stop until his head appeared through the rain. Those memories rose up like a tide and pushed my instincts toward protection rather than punishment. He told me he had hidden the truth to spare me pain and to prevent gossip. He said he feared being reduced to a story people whispered about at parties instead of being seen as a person in need. Hearing that my heart broke for both the child who once needed me and the adult who now trembled with private fears. I promised him I would not tell, not because secrecy was an end, but because safety mattered more than the small relief of explanation. I promised to learn what we needed to know, to find doctors who treated with care, to stand with him through the slow work of recovery. The pressure in his hand eased a little. A soft breath left him that was part relief and part terror. The machines in the room kept their steady counting like a clock that would not be hurried. Outside the window, the city continued indifferent and ordinary. Inside that narrow room, something changed shape between us, not into answers but into the beginning of a plan. I stayed holding his wrist, feeling the pulse that meant he was still here. And in that quiet, I understood that love, when it looks at fear and still chooses care, can be the truest kind of home. I understood it in fragments, each small truth sharpening the shape of a plan. The marriage was not a promise, but a contract, a legal measure to meet the condition I had set for Carter Hill, and once that fact settled inside me, the neat world I had built felt vulnerable. Logan and Nora had agreed to register their marriage purely to qualify for the conditional transfer. The clause required a lawful spouse and a 3-year period of marriage for full title, and she had positioned herself at the right moment to benefit. At first, I tried to believe it was practical, a temporary arrangement for stability. But the more I listened, the less comfortable that explanation became. Between the lines of their polite words, I found intent, and intent becomes a plan when nobody stops it. I remember Logan talking about soil and seedlings, about nitrogen cycles and irrigation, his voice full of the steady, quiet hunger of someone building something legitimate. He poured himself into the farm, and the profits rose seasonal by seasonal. The fields rewarded careful hands. I felt proud and relieved, thinking a good life was finally unfolding for him after so much solitude. I did not know then that while he traced rows and read market reports, Nora had laid claim to another kind of ledger. She had asked me questions about trusts and savings with an interest that seemed suddenly practical rather than curious. She smiled and spoke of partnership, offering help, and promising support. And I perhaps naively accepted the comfort of her words. Later, I discovered she had kept a copy of the transfer documents, quietly safeguarding the contract as if she anticipated need. That secret copy was a bargaining chip. When Logan left for surgery abroad and complications arrived, He returned weakened and required care. Nora did not follow. She stayed and stepped into the role of manager, signing forms, calling meetings, steering decisions in the painful interval when he could not. The farm grew under Logan's plans, but Nora controlled the short list of signatures the bank notices the access to counsel. At the same time, she shared a private tenderness with Riley Thompson, the companion I had first met, in a moment that did not sit right in my chest. The intimacy between them was more than casual friendship, and it made the coincidence of timing look like design. The marriage that had been a legal key had become a door Nora could lock when Logan was absent, and the promise of cooperation had curdled into a quiet consolidation of control. The sting of betrayal is sharpest when it is practical rather than passionate. I felt hollowed by the way trust had been traded for paperwork and soft words. That hollow turned to resolve. I would not let Carter Hill be reduced to the shadow of a scheme. I would read every page, confront every signature, and if promises had been used as bait, I would drag them into the light. The moment I heard that Nora had been asking about the safe code and the registration papers for the antique car, a cold line ran down my spine, and I felt the room tilt. Small details suddenly added up into a pattern that made my hands go numb. I remembered the way she had smiled at me those first times, the polite questions about investments, and the careful compliments about the farm. Now those moments felt rehearsed, like warm-up lines before a performance that hid the real actors. Logan was lying in that narrow bed, breathing shallow and pale. His voice when he spoke was thin but urgent, and he told me that Nora had asked him to sign a power of attorney to manage company affairs, that she had asked him to authorize transfers and to grant access to accounts while he recovered. He said he had not read the documents closely. He said he had trusted her, and the pain had taken him before he could push back. I felt the word authorization like a blade. Legally phrased papers signed under duress or in confusion could change the ownership of land and the control of bank accounts, and the quiet, steady foundation I had built with careful saving and years of work could be shifted without my knowledge. My chest tightened with a mixture of rage and fear. How many small signatures had been collected like coins, each one seeming harmless, until added to the pile that bought influence and control. I thought about the conditional clause I had set when I transferred management rights. I thought about the 3-year rule and the reason for that clause. Had Nora planned around it from the start, keeping a secret copy, arranging for legal maneuvers the moment Logan was vulnerable? Had she been waiting for an opportunity to convert a temporary arrangement into permanent control? The thought made my fingers clench the sheet. I felt foolish for not recognizing the signs sooner, but more than that, I felt fierce. Motherhood sharpened into a clear, cold decision. I would not be passive while a legal document hollowed out the life my son and I had tried to preserve. I decided then to act with the methodical calm of my teaching years. If the enemy used contracts and signatures, I would answer with the same weapons knowledge and paperwork. I planned to request certified copies to visit the bank, to sit with a lawyer who would explain the exact reach of any power of attorney, and to check the chain of custody on every page that bore our names. I would examine every corner of the estate records, and I would find out who had received what and under what authority. Night had thinned into a determination that felt like a promise. The instinct that had first warned me had solidified into a strategy. I pressed my palm against Logan's wrist and felt the faint, steady pulse. I whispered that I would not let the paperwork become a prison, and beneath the fear, there was a new, resolute heat. I would follow the small legal footprints left by those who thought they could move a farm and a life without my noticing. I would learn their language and use it against them, and I would make sure that Carter Hill remained in the hands that honored it. I sank down at the edge of the hospital bed, the ceiling lights bright and indifferent. I gripped his hand until my knuckles ached and my tears soaked the sheet. His fingers were small and warm. His eyes searched mine with a fear I had never seen. He said he had not meant to deceive me and had only tried to find a way to live as himself. He said he never wanted to hurt me and begged me not to tell anyone because he feared people would turn on him. I felt my heart split between tenderness and fury. I wanted to cradle him and strike out at once. My voice broke as I told him I had raised him to tell the truth and stand by those who loved him. He said the path had been complicated, that surgery abroad seemed the only choice, and complications forced his return. He whispered. He had hidden things to protect me from pain, and because he feared people would not see his need. I listened to each small confession and felt the years between us fold into the single present moment. I thought of the nights I waited at bus stops and the lunches I wrapped of the quiet habits that add up to a life. And then anger came like cold water, because I understood that while my child lay vulnerable, someone had been calculating which signatures and papers would shift control. I saw in my mind the envelope and the hands that slid a document into a pocket as if the transaction were routine. I wanted to shout until the hospital rooms broke open and every polite face had to answer, but anger alone would not heal a person who had been through so much. So I laid my forehead against his and felt his pulse under my palm. He cried and asked me to keep his secret, saying he feared being hated and reduced to a story. My tears were fierce and clear, and with them came a decision that made the heat in my chest steady into purpose. If anyone profited from his suffering, I would bring the truth into the light and pursue justice with every lawful measure available. I would demand certified copies and visit banks and registries and sit with lawyers until every transaction was clear. I would learn the technical language used to move power and property and use it to undo harm. My love made me patient, and my outrage made me relentless. I held him until his breathing eased, and then I set my jaw and began to map out the steps I would take one measured act at a time. I vowed that no paper would privatize our grief or allow profit to be made from this pain. I would go to court if needed, rally allies and old friends, speak the truth in public, and see that every signature was accounted for, and justice served without mercy or delay. I called Harold Blake early the next morning, the phone warm in my hand, as if it understood the weight of what I asked. Harold answered with the steady voice of a man who had seen too many lies and who knew how to separate paper from motive. And when I told him it was Sienna on the line, he gave a long, low laugh that sounded like an old agreement. I walked him through the oddities in measured sentences, the way I had taught students to solve complex proofs, and I gave him names and numbers without drama. Nora Bennett and Riley Thompson, the silver sedan, with the plate I had written down, the Brookview apartment on the 12th floor, 2 round-trip tickets to Miami found on the table, an open suitcase, and the hospital entry that read post-operative recovery with a note about complications. I told him about the envelope slipped to a man in scrubs and about the nurse, Mary, who had helped me look up the record. I told him how Nora had asked about a safe code and vehicle papers and how Logan had whispered about signing a power of attorney while in pain. Harold did not interrupt. He made small sounds of understanding and then asked the most important question: is the client prepared to act only within the law? I said yes without hesitation. I knew my limits and the law that protected privacy in our country, and I wanted this done clean. Harold agreed to take the case on the condition that every step be lawful, that any tracking be limited to commercially available tags installed where permitted, and that any video evidence be captured in public spaces where there is no expectation of private confidentiality. He explained the difference between lawful surveillance and illegal intrusion, the way a teacher explains a rule and its moral basis. We could use a tracking tag on the sedan while it was in public. We could secure footage from surveillance cameras in the parking lot and from the hospital lobby, where there is an expectation of being seen, and we could gather documents and bank traces through subpoenas, or with consent, rather than by breaking into accounts. I supplied him with what I had, the license plate, the bank name, where Logan had an account, the exact times I had seen their comings and goings, and the names of people who had noticed odd behavior. Harold promised to open discreet inquiries, to interview neighbors and valet attendants, and to trace the chain on any document that might have moved ownership. He also advised up front that any evidence of financial manipulation would need to be corroborated with paper trails and signed records, and that the law requires patience and proof more than fury. I felt a strange comfort in that requirement. My anger needed structure, and Harold was offering a legal architecture for the response. I left him with payment and a list and a quiet instruction to be thorough but lawful. The private hunt had begun, and I had chosen it to be clean and relentless. The first evidence arrived like a wound opening slow and precise. Harold sent a package of video clips and stills with notes on timestamps and locations, and I sat at my kitchen table with the files glowing on the screen. The first clip shows Nora walking into a downtown pawn shop where high-end items are traded quietly. She moves with a composed, deliberate air, places a watch on the counter, and speaks with the clerk in a tone that sounds practiced. The angle catches the shop clock above the shelf, and the watch sits there, while the clerk examines it, the camera, holding that small, ordinary moment in which value is assessed and then turned into a promise of cash. I felt a coldness through my chest as the clerk wrapped the watch and pushed a neat bundle of bills across the counter. In the second clip, Riley is behind the wheel of Logan's Porsche. She parks at a private garage and walks with purpose into a storage bay where a buyer waits. The recording shows a quick handoff of a small case and a thick envelope. The buyer counts bills under the fluorescent lights and slides them across the hood. Riley takes the money and hands over the case, then closes the trunk and drives away the license plate reflecting the overhead sign. The exchange is brisk and businesslike, lacking any of the hesitant gestures of someone acting out of necessity. It looks like an arranged sale, practiced and discreet. Harold then sent a clip taken from a lens he positioned near the apartment entry. It shows Nora unlocking a heavy safe in the living room and lifting out a flat folio that contained a childhood treasure. The camera lingers on the stamps, close enough for their patterns and margins to be seen. Harold later told me the collection is rare, and that serious collectors might value it at about $50,000. The stamps still had Logan's uneven notes tucked between them, the childish ink marking dates and places. In the video, Nora handles the sheets without tenderness. She slides them into protective sleeves, and slides the folio into a bag, as if it were material to be moved, rather than memory to be honored. I watched each file until the light on my screen seemed to burn my eyes. With every replay, the pattern resolved further into an intent that had no room for accident. It was not need that had guided these hands. It was calculation. The keepsakes of a boy I once knew became currency in a series of transactions that read like a ledger of betrayal. Grief arrived first, dull and vast, then a precise, hot clarity that focused my next steps. I copied the clips to a secure drive and sent encrypted copies to Harold. I printed stills and cataloged times and locations. The evidence had weight now, and the weight made my plan possible. I would use the law and the record to undo what had been done, and I would make sure that every small sale and every quiet handoff was accounted for in a way that could not be smoothed over by polite lies now. I called Myra Johnson and spoke to her without preamble, giving her the files Harold had gathered and the list of transactions that smelled of theft. Myra listened calmly, asking measured questions about dates and names, then told me she would review the original transfer contract immediately. She read the clause I had insisted on, the 3-year condition and the requirement of a lawful marriage, and her face tightened when I described the pawnshop footage and the envelope handed to the doctor. After an hour, she said 2 words that felt like a Lifeline Civil Code section: 1572 fraudulent conveyance. She explained that if a transfer was induced by fraud or misrepresentation, the grantor had the right to seek a court order to set aside the conveyance and to request immediate provisional relief, including a temporary freeze on accounts and a restraining order against further transfers. My heart raced. The legal language made my case audible in a way my instincts could not. Myra drafted an emergency motion that night, concise and precise, attached sworn declarations from the detective and from the nurse who had confirmed the record, and demanded an ex parte hearing to prevent any movement of funds or assets. She told me she would file with the county court and serve the papers on the bank where Logan had accounts, and she advised that the judge could issue a temporary restraining order on the same day if the facts were persuasive. I watched her work like a conductor leading an orchestra, every signature and affidavit arranged to create legal pressure. Within 48 hours, the motion was filed, the bank had acknowledged receipt, and a clerk confirmed a hearing slot was scheduled for the next morning. The clerk said it was unusual for such rapid action, but the weight of the evidence, coupled with properly sworn testimony, made the case urgent. I sat in the lawyer's waiting room and felt a tightness shift into brittle hope. If the court granted the freeze, no more watches would be sold, no more stamps would be removed from the safe, and any power of attorney that had been used to move money could be suspended while the court untangled the signatures. I thought of Logan, lying in the recovery room, fragile and trusting, and I felt both relief and a new anger that hardened into resolve. Myra warned me the legal road would be slow and litigious, that countersuits and objections were likely, but she also promised that concrete steps had been taken to protect the estate. I left her office with copies of the filed motion in my bag, the weight of paper a strange comfort, and the plan ahead forming around the simple idea that law could be used as a shield as well as a sword. I promised to watch every signature and follow each transaction, to recontact witnesses for testimony, and to pursue this fight through every courtroom until Carter Hill remained in right hands. I volunteered for the night shift without announcing it as a dramatic gesture. I told Mary I could cover a long hour she needed off, and she handed me the uniform and the badge with a look that mixed relief and pity. Putting on the scrubs felt strange and necessary at once. The fabric smelled faintly of disinfectant and starch, and the badge clipped to my chest made my name feel like a new identity. I learned quickly how the hospital moved at night. The lights were dimmer, footsteps, softer conversations hushed, and a different kind of attention hung in the air. I checked the locks on the door to the recovery wing, as if sealing the farmhouse after a storm. I walked the corridor with the measured steps I had taught my students to take when they solved hard problems, and I listened for anything out of the ordinary. I learned the HIPAA rules again through the small rituals of the shift. No names called in the hall, no patient details given to random callers' visitors, screened against the list, each signature and ID checked and rechecked. I sat vigil beside Logan and watched the steady rise and fall of his chest until the machines hummed a rhythm that felt like a promise. When the phone on the nurse station lit up with Nora calling and insisting on being allowed to see the patient, Mary answered with the professional firmness that comes from long experience and from an oath. She told the caller that the patient had specifically requested only the mother be allowed to visit, and she recorded the refusal in the log with neat handwriting. I felt a small, fierce relief. That log was a legal thin line, but it was better than nothing. Later, I walked to the end of the hall and watched the elevator doors open. Nora stood there with her coat wrapped tight, face flushed with anger that she tried to hide behind a mask of composure. Riley gripped her arm, pulling her back down the corridor, as if guiding a child away from a dangerous ledge, and the way Riley looked at Nora was a look I had seen before, an insolent, protective intimacy that made my blood run cold. I returned to the bedside and smoothed the blanket over Logan, feeling the small weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders like a cloak I could not remove. At times I had to speak to visiting staff as if I were an ordinary night nurse asking about medication times and checking the charts, and each time I did it, I learned a new rule of the ward and a new way to keep a patient safe. I kept the visitor log by my hand and watched the door directly, and when the night nurses changed shift, I rehearsed in my head how to explain my presence if anyone asked. I did not sleep. The nap I took was short and more like dozing on a chair with one hand still on Logan's wrist. My mind ran through legal steps and phone numbers and the names of people I would call at dawn, but all of that was wrapped around the single present work of being with him. Standing guard in a uniform that was not mine taught me a heavy truth. Love looks unglamorous in fluorescent light. It keeps count of time, it reads rules and fills forms, and it turns ordinary acts into a shield. If Nora and Riley were planning anything rash, they would find me present and watchful, and I would answer every attempt with paperwork witnesses and the quiet insistence of someone who would not be moved from her post. Friday night had the thin electric silence of a place waiting to break, and I sat in my car, watching Harold's clips on my phone, each frame like a small confession. He sent footage of Nora and Riley carrying suitcases into the apartment, sliding a laptop into a box, and stuffing folders full of papers with hands that knew what they were doing. The timestamp slid toward midnight, and then jumped as if the camera itself had hurried them on. Harold called and told me plainly that they had purchased one-way tickets to Mexico City, a flight leaving at 2 a.m. His voice did not tremble. My stomach dropped, and everything else narrowed to the single clear thought that I must act before they vanished. I phoned Myra and then Harold again, and we agreed that this was the moment to move because the videos and the timestamps met the legal standard we needed. I dialed the local police and spoke with Lieutenant Alvarez, giving him the evidence packet and the flight information, and I could hear the shift in his tone from routine to readiness. A squad arrived at the garage with flashlights and radios, and I joined them with my hands steady, though my heart felt like it had escaped its cage. The garage lights hummed harsh and fluorescent as Nora and Riley rolled suitcases to the elevator, moving fast as if rehearsing an escape plan. Riley glanced once at the vehicle and then back to the door, her movements abrupt. I watched them from the shadows and felt the air go thin when the officer stepped forward and announced a lawful stop while another read the rights, and the detective called out commands. Nora's face drained of color, and Riley's mouth opened in a sound that was half protest and half plea, but the officers were calm and efficient. They unzipped a suitcase and found cash bundled in rubber bands, a Patek Philippe watch wrapped in a cloth, and folders thick with forged documents and papers stamped with false endorsements. The guard cuffed hands that had once seemed polite in living rooms and polite on phones, and their eyes met mine for a moment that felt like a reckoning. I felt vindication rise, but it was edged with a cold sorrow because betrayal and theft had been the work of people who had entered our lives under pretenses. The officers thanked Harold for the surveillance and Myra for the motion that had already frozen accounts, and they explained that the evidence would be photographed logged, and inventoried. I stood beside the concrete column while they read charges in a voice that carried, and the red and blue lights swept across the scene like an accusation made visible. An officer handed me a sealed evidence bag, and I felt the worn leather strap of the watch, its small weight like a verdict I could hold in my hands. In that moment, I thought of Logan in his hospital bed, of the stitches on his chest, and the way he had asked me to keep his secret, and a fierce tenderness braided with righteous anger. I told the lieutenant simply that I wanted the full extent of the law used to protect what belonged to my family, and he promised we would follow every lead. As they led Nora and Riley past me, I felt a chapter close, and another opened the night, breaking into action, and promises that this would be accounted for in court. They sat Nora in a hard chair under the bright strip light, and the room smelled faintly of coffee and bleach. Her mascara had run into dark rivers that made her eyes look smaller and more frantic, and when she spoke, her voice trembled like someone reciting lines learned for a trial run. She said she only followed Logan's request. She said he asked her to move money. She said she did it for him because he wanted to go back to Thailand. The words were breathy and urgent, but they sounded like a script I had heard in smaller forms from manipulators and con artists. I listened without flinching. I had learned long ago that crocodile tears are paid for by practiced hands. Inspector Walker placed the evidence bag on the metal table with a sound that made the room sharper. The bag contained a neat envelope of cash, the folded cloth with the Patek Philippe inside, and a small USB stick wrapped in tape. He slid the bag toward Nora as if offering her a mirror. The device glinted under the light, and I could almost see my own jaw set reflected there. Mary sat just outside the observation window, taking notes like a witness who knows the truth but keeps the rhythm of procedure. Nora tried to make her face open and innocent. She tried to gather pity as if it were currency. She told the story in fragments, always returning to the same line that she helped only because of Logan. I felt the shape of each sentence before it landed. It was designed to fracture my resolve into sympathy and confusion. My hands were folded in my lap. I felt the cool leather of Logan's hospital bracelet in my pocket, as if it were an anchor that held me to reality. I breathed slowly, counting the seconds as a teacher counts through a difficult problem, and I let the silence do part of my work. Silence weighs on a liar the way night does on a noisy town. It makes the small noises of truth stand out. Inspector Walker outlined the charges without drama. He moved through the facts the way someone reads the lines of a ledger. He explained that the USB contained a copy of a transfer agreement with Logan's signature, and that handwriting analysis by a certified expert would be conclusive. He said the cash matched serial numbers linked to the pawnshop sale, and that the watch was identified by the family's paperwork. He mentioned forged stamps on bank forms and an authorization with suspicious timestamps. Each detail arrived like a brick placed on a pile. The pile began to look like a wall. Nora's voice moved from plea to panic, and then to small, sharp anger as the air closed around her claims. I thought of the afternoon she asked me about my savings like a neighbor asking for a recipe. I thought of the times she said she was helpful and meant it like a promise. I leaned forward then. My eyes met hers without a single theatrical twitch. I told her that love does not demand theft. I said that care does not wear the face of ledger entries. I did not shout. There was no need. The truth in front of us was slow and patient, and the law had a way of turning patient truth into consequence. When Walker read the list of seized items and the phrase evidence bag one more time, Nora's shoulders finally slumped. The mask fell into the empty chair like something that had been rigged to collapse. I felt a small, sharp relief that belonged to justice and a hollow that belonged to the cost of betrayal. I would take the legal road. I would teach the law to the people who tried to use it as a cloak. I opened the file bag with hands that would not stop shaking the papers inside, feeling heavier than their weight. Myra had stamped and notarized the copies, so they were ironclad, the original will and the bank statements sitting like cold proof on my lap. I set them on the metal table and looked at Nora, letting the silence stretch until it felt like it had a shape. Then I spoke, measured and steady, telling her that she must have forgotten something very basic. Logan never signed any power of attorney naming her any authority she pretended to hold was a shadow without a signature. The words landed hard and clean. I could see the color leave her face as if ink had drained from the room. Inspector Walker slid a fax across the table, his movements slow, almost ceremonial. The paper bore a bank header and a line I had not wanted to read. There was an outgoing transfer to an account in Bali. The amount matched cash bundles we had recovered, and the beneficiary was listed as Riley Thompson. The room hummed with a low, practical noise, the sound of a procedure being sewn into place. My mind did not rush. It cataloged. The will revoked contingent conveyance on conditions of fraud. The account numbers traced the timestamps aligning with the footage Harold had supplied. Each small detail clicked into the machinery of a case that could be shown to a judge. Riley bowed her head, then shoulders contracting as if to fold up into a smaller shape. Her hands trembled, and she spoke in a voice no louder than the whir of the copier, saying that it was not her fault, and that Nora had forced her, had given orders she felt she could not refuse. Her words unraveled in the air like a frayed thread. Nora recovered some of her practiced composure and launched into a different strain of performance, one designed to conjure pity and confusion. She claimed that everything was done for Logan, that her intentions had been to secure safety, to facilitate care, to manage complicated affairs while he was ill. I watched her mouth form those justifications, and I felt a cold clarity tighten in my chest. The gestures were well rehearsed, the timing convenient. Inspector Walker read the bank fax again and then pointed to the certified will, explaining clearly that Civil Code Section 1572 covered fraudulent conveyances and that we had grounds to ask the court to set aside any instruments procured by deceit. He explained how the temporary freeze already in place would hold until evidentiary hearings could be arranged. The weight of legal language was strangely comforting, a framework that made my anger functional. I felt both a raw pain for my child and a rising, precise determination to see this through by the book. I told the room that I wanted every forged document examined by a handwriting expert, that any power of attorney presented should be traced back to its originals, and that the bank should produce logs and copies of each transfer. I asked for Riley to be interviewed under oath. I asked for custodial subpoenas where needed. They agreed and set the wheels in motion. In that moment, holding the notarized will between my palms, I understood that our fight would be legal and relentless. Love had become the ground for an exacting campaign, and I was ready to translate grief into strategy. Riley sat across from me with hands folded and her voice thin. When she began to speak, it was in halting fragments. Then the fragments joined into a terrible clarity. She confessed that Nora had designed a plan to strip the Carter Hill accounts, to funnel the proceeds through a shell company in Indonesia, splitting transfers into many small entries labeled as consulting and logistics so that U.S. regulators would not notice a single large withdrawal. Then Riley lowered her gaze and said in a voice that broke that she loved Nora and had believed they would start a life together in Bali. She said she had trusted Nora, that she had been recruited by promises and pressure, and that she had never imagined the scheme would become murderous. Her words landed like a blow when she added that she did not know Nora intended to coerce Logan into signing a forged will, and she did not know Nora planned to give him an overdose of sedatives, so he could not object. The room fell thin with a sound like a held breath as the implications landed and reality reformed itself into something darker. Nora's face, hitherto composed, drained of color, and then contorted into frantic denial as she screamed that Riley was lying and that everything had been done for Logan's good. Her protestations sounded practiced, but small tells betrayed her, the way a hand shook when it sought a tissue, the rapid blink that did not match the performance. I sat very still and let the officers do their work. Inspector Walker read portions of Riley's statement aloud and asked her to identify dates, bank names, and a doctor's name, and she complied with a trembling accuracy that made the paper trail real. The detective produced a bank fax and pointed to a transaction that was routed through an account in Bali and then funneled onward, the amount matching what had been seized from the pawnshop sale. I felt a mixture of cold fury and a deep, unfamiliar sorrow for the girl who sat crying in front of me and for the child who lay on a hospital bed trusting us to keep him alive. This was no longer only about property or contract clauses. It had become a question of intent and of possible harm, and the stakes had leapt from ledger entries to life itself. My resolve sharpened into a plan. I would use every legal tool, every witness statement, and every piece of paper Riley had described to dismantle the scheme. I looked Nora in the eye without shouting, and I said slowly and clearly that a mother would not allow calculations to replace care, and that if any harm had been intended, she would be brought to justice. The words seemed small against the enormity of what had been confessed, but they contained a promise that felt like iron, and the police moved with a new energy to follow the threads Riley had revealed. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room settle on me like a small weight. My legs were steady, my hands not shaking, though my heart drummed hard against my ribs. I walked the short space between the metal table and Nora, and I looked at her straight in the face. Her mascara had tracked down her cheeks into dark lines. She tried to make a laugh sound like a defense, and her mouth formed a sneer when she called me an old, lonely woman nobody needed. The insult landed like a stone meant to make me shrink, but I did not step back. I kept my voice low and clear, because shouting would only feed the theater she wanted. I said that she was not only greedy, and I said it in a way that left no room for a pleasantry. I told her that she had forgotten one basic fact. A mother may grow old, I said, but she never becomes foolish. The room held its breath at that, as if the words laid a kind of claim the way a signature holds a contract. Inspector Walker looked up from his notes and gave a small, almost hidden nod of agreement, the kind of gesture that means the facts line up with the feeling in the air. Nora tried to roll her eyes and answer with another cutting line about my loneliness, but her voice cracked, and the line sounded practiced. She was looking for sympathy, but the performance was thin and brittle now that the evidence sat on the table and the law had been named. I felt anger, yes, but it was mixed with a clear purpose. I was not angry in the hot way that loses control. I was steady in the cold way that plans next steps. I reminded her that I had both law and truth. Those were not threats. Those were tools. I had watched the papers move from my hand into Harold S. files, into Myra S. motion, into the court record that had already frozen accounts. I had seen the video clips, the pawn shop receipts, the bank faxes, the seeded transfers to Bali, the forged signatures. None of it was beautiful, but everything could be proven. Saying that I had the law and the truth changed the room. It made the officials sit straighter, made Riley look down and twist her fingers, and it made Nora's face lose color. I thought of the nights I had kept vigil at hospital beds of the afternoons, spent learning about trusts and deeds, of the quiet persistence that had built Carter Hill into more than land. I thought of Logan, breathing in the recovery room, trusting me to see him safe. My words were not meant to humiliate Nora. They were meant to end the theater, to let justice fill the space where lies had tried to live. When I finished speaking, the silence that followed was not soft. It was heavy with consequence. Even Walker S.'s small nod felt like confirmation that a Mother S. quiet strength could change the shape of a case, and I sat down, knowing that I had used everything I had to protect the person I loved. I felt the room tilt when the officer read the charges out loud: fraud, theft, and second-degree murder. And in that thin strip of light, Nora's face went from color to a burning red as she snapped that I would pay for destroying her life. The words hit like stones, but I did not flinch. I kept my hands folded on my lap and breathed slow to steady the rush in my chest. Riley collapsed into tears, shoulders shaking, and she turned to me and said she was sorry, and that she truly meant it, her voice breaking into small pieces. I did not answer with words. I only let a thought rise up and settle, that forgiveness is not a gift for the one who broke you, but a door you open for yourself to walk through and be free. The handcuffs clicked and metal echoed, officers moved with quiet precision, and Nora lifted her head as they led her away. For a beat, I saw something change in her eyes. The sharp flames of hatred fell away, and what remained was a strange, exhausted calm that did not look like victory. The fluorescent light caught her pupils, and for a moment, she looked smaller than the fury that had filled her mouth a minute before. As they read her rights and guided her out, papers shuffled, and the deputy asked a few routine questions, and I felt a relief that was jagged and honest, like a door closed on a night I would rather forget. I thought of Logan lying in recovery with stitches along his chest, and the small voice that had whispered fear of being hated, and that memory steeled me more than any anger. Riley leaned forward and begged for a chance to tell the whole truth, and in the wet smear of her apology, I saw evidence of real regret. I watched her look at Nora, and in that look, something shifted, an unmasking that no courtroom or list of charges could quite capture. I told Riley quietly that what mattered most was the truth, and that the law would have its pages to turn, and she nodded as if those words gave shape to something she had been too frightened to name. Outside the interrogation room, the corridor was full of ordinary hospital noise: a trolley, a distant pager, a muted conversation, and I stepped into that ordinary world, feeling the antiseptic taste on my tongue and a tired steadiness in my limbs. I promised myself then to follow every document and every witness until the account of what had happened could not be bent. I promised to make sure no one could turn my son's pain into profit again. When the door closed behind Nora and the red and blue lights faded from view, I felt an unexpected peace that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with standing up to what was wrong. For now, the arrest had exposed a terrible truth and given me a place to start, and I let the small quiet hold me while I gathered strength for what would come next. The day the court read the verdict felt like the last winter light pouring through the courthouse windows, thin and honest, and I sat with my hands folded until they trembled from the waiting. Evidence had been stacked like stones, each clip and bank statement, and sworn affidavit placed precisely by Harold and Myra, and the judge moved through the papers with the steady patience of someone clearing brush from a path. The prosecution laid out the scheme in plain terms: how accounts had been drained, how forged signatures had been used, how transfers were routed through shell companies, and how a plan had been set to silence the only person who could stand in the way. The defense scrambled at first voices and objections fluttering like moths, but when Riley took the stand and repeated her statements with the same shaking honesty as in the interrogation, the case crystallized into undeniable fact. The court did not feel theatrical. It felt like a place finally doing the job it was meant to do, a mechanism turning evidence into consequence. When the judge pronounced Nora guilty on counts for fraud theft and second-degree murder, the room held a breath that felt almost like release. The sentence that followed was measured an absolute 12 years without the mercy of probation, and the words landed with a weight that had been earned by the paper trail and the witness testimony. Riley received a different measure reduced because she had cooperated and because her testimony untangled key pieces of the plot, and she was given 5 years and a period of supervised release afterward. Watching the bailiff lead Nora away, I felt a complex tide of feeling. Anger was there, a cold, hot thing that wanted to shout at the faces that had lied and stolen. But below it was a quieter thing that felt like grief and relief braided together. Nora turned her head once as she passed, and I saw her eyes attempt anger, then slide into something smaller, a hard, brittle laugh that sounded like a person trying to keep a mask from cracking. She called out that the world favors the hypocrites, and the words came out thin and hollow. I did not answer aloud. My silence was deliberate. I let the law speak for itself, and I let the truth sit where it belonged. In the days after the verdict, the practical work began. Myra moved to finalize reversals. Banks complied with the freeze and accounts were untangled so that Carter Hill could be secured. Harold continued to document and to hand over every recorded exchange, ensuring no thread was left loose. I visited Logan once the legal dust had settled and sat with him while he read the court filings in a voice that trembled with more than physical weakness. He looked up and said he felt safe in a way he had not in months, and his small hand in mine steadied me more than any legal victory. The sentence did not erase the pain, nor did it return what had been taken, but it enforced a truth. People who build schemes on other people as suffering will face consequences, and the idea of that simple, firm justice gave me a kind of peace. Standing at the edge of the courthouse steps, as people moved about their ordinary lives, I understood that justice had its limits, and so did revenge, but that standing up had been necessary. I felt older and more tired, and also oddly lighter, as if some of the weight of worry had been lifted, and I promised myself to guard what remained with the same quiet stubbornness that had gotten me this far. 3 weeks passed, and they finally signed the discharge papers, the nurse handing the clipboard to me with a small, tired smile, as if she had been carrying the secret weight of our nights too. And I pushed the wheelchair through the sliding doors under a sky that had the pale promise of late spring. He looked smaller than the son I remembered from the riverbank days, the hospital gown hanging loose over a frame that had thinned in ways illness makes obvious, but there was no flinch in his eyes when people passed by, no shrinking back from the world, only a deep and patient gaze that held both sorrow and a new steadiness. I helped him into the car, folded the blanket over his knees, and for a long while we drove without talking, the radio low and our hands close in the middle. Back home, the farmhouse felt both familiar and altered, like a book you have read before, but find new margins in, and I watched him move through rooms, slowly testing strength and breath, as if each step was a small homework assignment from his recovery. He began to see a therapist who specialized in gender and identity, someone with a voice that could hold complicated truths without judgment. And I sat in some sessions when he asked, learning the language of pronouns and reconciling terms I had not thought about. And slowly, the strange words began to make sense, because they were attached to him. He practiced saying I instead of he, at times sometimes mixing the words like a child learning speech, and each honest attempt was a small miracle. He worked on trust with a counselor who taught him to map fear and place facts beside feelings, and in the evenings we built a new quiet routine of tea and short walks and a book between us. One afternoon, late and tender, he took my hand and held it like a promise that needed holding, and then he said softly that he was still my son, only different in form, and the words landed in me like a bell that rings true, even when the air around it is cold. The first feeling that rose was a fierce protectiveness, the old instinct that had once kept watch at bus stops and baked too many pies, then softened into recognition of the one who had always been there under the surface. I stroked his hair and told him in my own quiet way that he was the child I had rocked, that names and shapes were less strong than the steady fact of love, and that what mattered was him being seen and safe and whole. Tears came both ours, and they were not all sorrow. Some were relief, some were the slow pleasure of forgivings, and small reconciliations that take time to grow. In the evenings, he began to speak more freely about future plans, about therapy goals, about perhaps returning to the land in small ways, and each sentence was a small bridge rebuilt between us. Watching him read, watching his fingers rest on the table and not tremble as much, I felt the heavy knot of worry loosen into a new thread of hope. This was not an ending, but a rebirth that required patience, law doctors, and also that stubborn human thing called love. I promised quietly then to him and to myself to stand beside him as he reclaimed himself, and I found that promise kept me steady, even when the nights were hard. When the local papers picked up the story, I felt a strange heat behind my ribs, a mix of relief and embarrassment, because I had never wanted attention, only truth. The Savannah Herald ran a piece that read, "Mother, age 68, uses mind and mercy to overturn a fraud," and the headline felt both strange and right, as if a small part of my life had been finally put on a shelf that made sense. People I had waved to in the grocery store for years began to stop me on sidewalks, and at church, offering handshakes that lasted a beat too long, or slipping a folded loaf of banana bread into my arms, as if bread could say thank you for me, and I accepted each gesture with that odd mix of pride and fatigue. The pastor at St. Michael called and asked if I would speak at their senior workshop about vigilance and financial safety, and I agreed, because it felt like a way to turn what had nearly destroyed us into a warning that might protect someone else. Standing at that podium, I felt the room tighten and then loosen as I told the story in plain sentences, leaving out legal technicalities and keeping the moments that mattered, the tiny clues I had ignored, and then followed the way a mother learns to listen for the difference between ordinary silence and the silence that hides a secret. After the talk, people stayed to share small confessions. Elderly women saying they had once been embarrassed to ask for help and now felt brave men who had worked banks leaning forward to ask how to spot a forged signature, and one young neighbor voice, trembling, said that she had always assumed older people were easy targets and that she would now check in more often with her grandmother. The visitation did not stop at the workshop. Neighbors brought flowers, a woman from the PTA brought a pie still warm from the oven, and even the man who had once complained that I was set in my ways came to the porch with a tin of cookies and a quiet apology. The county paper ran an editorial about dignity and courage, and a small television crew came to film me, arranging jars of peach jam on my kitchen shelf, the camera finding the same hands that had once counted receipts and balanced ledgers. In church the next Sunday, the minister introduced me as a woman who had shown how stubborn care can be a weapon against greed, and the applause felt like a tide that carried away some of the isolation I had carried for years. I walked the streets differently after that, not loud, but less invisible. And children who once waved shyly now waved full hand waves and called out, "Hello, Mrs. Carter," as if they recognized that I had earned a place in their imagining of our town. I think the most powerful moments were quiet ones when people who had written me off as old-fashioned came to sit on my porch and tell me about their fears, and when they left, they looked steadier. Inside me, something shifted too. The relief was not only that justice had been done, but that our name Carter felt right again, unburdened by whispers and suspicion. I had gone to the court to defend property and to save a farm, but what returned to me was more tender than property. It was the restoration of respect that feeds a small town, the sense that right action can change how people see one another, and that is a kind of homecoming I did not know I needed. They led Nora away, and the courthouse doors closed like a chapter, and I did not feel triumph as much as a heavy, steady relief that settled into my bones. The town had watched the headlines, and the prison intake photo ran across the late news, and when I later learned how the other inmates reacted, I was not surprised. But I still felt a sharp twist of sorrow. A woman in the block said that she would not sit near someone who had betrayed a man while he lay in a hospital bed, and the comment landed with a cold clarity, because betrayal has its small, brutal public currency even behind bars. Riley tried to make amends with a handwritten letter she wrote with the kind of trembling that comes from nights that do not let you sleep, and she folded the page and mailed it with stamps, bought in a hurry. The envelope returned to her with a brief notation that forgiveness does not mean forgetting, and when I saw the line, I understood what the clerk meant. Forgiveness is a landscape you walk through, not a place you declare from the outside, and I had to hold that in my heart, even while my hands worked the paper trail of justice. The money Nora had taken and the things she sold could not be unbought, but they could be repurposed. We set up a foundation named for the farm, and for the lesson, it held a simple account at the community bank, and a mission that would help elders guard their assets and learn to spot the slow ways people can take advantage. We called it the Carter Foundation for Elder Financial Justice, and the name felt like a careful stitch between wrong and repair. Donors from the town who had once stood to the side now brought small checks and larger pledges, and the local church offered its hall for workshops, where we taught neighbors how to check documents, how to ask for identification, and how to have custody plans that did not depend on a single signature. The foundation was not a trophy for me. It was a tool that carried the truth that harm leaves scars, but that those scars can be taught into caution and into care. In the evenings, I would walk past the small library and see a poster advertising a seminar, and sometimes a woman who had once crossed the street to avoid me would stop and ask a question about wills or about bank notices, and the questions were honest and soft. In prison, Nora learned the most public part of karma, which is not a neat revenge, but a slow, procedural unspooling of consequence, and I saw her name shrink in headlines as the work of repair grew larger. That did not mean I was satisfied, because satisfaction would be a cheap thing against months of fear and the cost of trust, but it meant the balance had shifted. I had wanted to save a farm and a life, and what followed was messy and righteous and bureaucratic, and in that mixture community found a way to raise a shield around those who could be prey. Some afternoons I would plant a new row of herbs at Carter Hill and think about what had been taken and what we had turned toward others, and the soil took the tears and the work without asking questions, and that felt like justice in a slow and honest season. I walked out of the hospital into a late afternoon that felt softer than the nights I had spent under fluorescent lights, my feet moving without rush toward the small orphanage where I volunteered to teach math. The air smelled of cut grass and a hint of peach from the jars on my passenger seat, and for a moment, I let the world hold me like a hand on my shoulder. Children ran at me as I climbed the steps, faces bright and honest, and one little boy shouted my name and wrapped his small arms around my waist. I laughed, the sound raw and honest, and felt something unclench inside me. This was the arithmetic of living simple sums that did not care for the complications people made out of greed and fear. I sat at the small table with a stack of worksheets writing problems with neat columns and simple numbers, and the kids bent their heads to the task like they were solving tiny mysteries. A girl with a gap in her teeth looked up and asked how to divide a number by 3, and I guided her fingers through the steps, feeling the patient rhythm of teaching settle over me. When your son has stitched lines along his chest, and when people have tried to turn those stitches into profit, returning to routines that teach and heal felt like an act of reclamation. I found the work steadied me, the repetition of multiplication tables grounding me in the ordinary, and the ordinary was what I wanted to protect. After class, I sat with a thermos of tea and wrote a letter to my child. The ink felt steady in my hand as I wrote that when my child was ready, the farm and the porch would be here waiting. I wrote that home is where hands are offered and not judged, and that time could be a quiet friend to mend fear into courage. I folded the letter and tucked it into an envelope, then walked around the yard and watched the light move through the swings like gold. An old boy came up and asked me if I believed forgiveness was a weakness, and I thought of the nights I had spent planning and the days I had spent waiting, and I said that forgiveness is a choice that frees the giver, not a gift to the person who caused harm. My voice was calm, and the truth of it felt like a small bell. Walking back to my car, I paused under the oak and felt the last light warm my face, thinking about how life adds and subtracts in ways we do not control. I thought about Logan reading in his room as he learned to steady his breath, and about how our names can be washed clean by hard work and truth. I mailed the letter and drove slowly past the fields where the rows of young shoots caught the sun. There was a sense of opening, not an ending, and I felt both grief and a steady hope that could carry the heavy days. If you have been betrayed and you still choose kindness, share your story. Your truth might be the quiet courage someone else needs, and sometimes a simple act of honesty can become the sum that adds up to change.